Hello, my name is Jack Clark, and today I'll be talking about the Carboniferous period of the planet and the giant insects that inhabited the ecosystem. I'll be going over what conditions needed to exist in order for these giant insects to adapt and take root in the world that they lived in, as well as how uh, an understanding of what the world was like back then affects how we think about the world now. So the Carboniferous period is kind of the age of oxygen. We have this massive boom in concentration of oxygen in the air. This was anywhere from 360 to 300 million years ago. And when we talk about high oxygen concentration, it gets really high. Currently, concentration of oxygen in the air is about 20%. And at its highest, the oxygen concentration during the Carboniferous was as high as 35%. Uh, this was mostly thanks to the fact that trees would just grow and grow and grow, and there were so many uh, ways for them to sprout up and trap all of that carbon in them, and there wasn't any way to break them down and release all that carbon back out into the ecosystem. So you're eating all of this carbon up and producing all of this oxygen with no way of breaking the oxygen back down. So you end up with much higher concentrations than we're used to, thanks to the fact that these trees couldn't really decay. Even when they died, they would just sit there forever, just holding on to the carbon, eventually becoming the coal that we would use today. Um, Insects at the time had it pretty good. Uh, their oxygen delivery system is very different from the way that we lived as humans, and they use that to their advantage. They breathe through air sacs and trachea that exist all over their body, not just through one set of lungs. And because of this, the bigger their body is, the better they can transport this oxygen and the better they can support themselves. So, in an environment that is so full of oxygen, they're promoted to be bigger and bigger over time. And they would get as large as their environment would accommodate. So, in a high oxygen environment like the Carboniferous, they became massive. But we don't see things that big today, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Over time, microbes started to come around that would eat up those dead plants and return all of that carbon back into the ecosystem, allowing the oxygen to be broken back down, added into the cycle. There were other environmental factors that also decreased oxygen levels, which meant that the large insects of the past didn't have the capacity to support themselves at such a large size. We also see the introduction of predators like certain birds that would uh, very much prefer to have these big, vulnerable insects as uh, a source of energy. And so being really big just made them a target. So eventually it was just better for them to go smaller and smaller, as there's no aspect of the world that was really for them anymore. So, we can look at the Carboniferous period and go, cool, we had huge bugs and uh, we had this huge oxygen rich environment, but why do we even really care? Um, and there's a great number of ecological questions that we can consider about the history of the earth as well as our future to try and uh, ascertain what the actual importance of this is. So, first things first is when we see these massive fossils of these gigantic old bugs, it needs to have a question attached to it that's, how did stuff used to exist like this? Why didn't it exist now? What was the world like that had to support these type of creatures? And in answering that question, we come to another set of ideas which end up being, uh, how do we live now compared to how the environment was back then? And how do those features affect the way that we live now? And are we possibly going back to it? We're not. Um, Over time, looking at a lot of events like this, we see that the climate often moves in cycles of high carbon rich atmospheres to low carbon rich atmospheres. We've seen things like snowball Earth, where the planet will periodically freeze over. And all of that comes from this idea of we see something in the past, we need to understand it, and we look to uh, the information that we currently have around us, these fossils that have us uh, dig deeper into the questions of what is the planet like? Are we affecting the planet in a way that we would need to go back to that? If we're changing the environment in ways that reflect how it used to exist, if we're making the air more oxygen rich, if we're increasing our amount of greenhouse gases, how is that going to look based off of what we already know about the Earth's climate history? And by getting to compare to this old world, we get to understand where we might be going in the future and how we might want to change what's going on in our world in order to steer towards a better climate for a better future. That's all I wanted to say on the history of these giant insects, and I thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.